Hello, and welcome to Voices in Action. Over the next hour and a half, I will guide you through this interactive training that is designed to help you effectively tell your mental health story. Everyone has a story, whether you're an individual living with a mental health diagnosis, a family member, or service provider. Voices in Action will help you develop the skills to effectively tell your story. Before we begin, make sure you have everything you need by downloading these handouts from the NAMI Wisconsin website. Depending on your preference, you can either print them or have them open and ready to pull up on your computer as we go through the slides. If you are doing this training alone, you will need the following: 7 steps to telling your story, 1 sample story of your choosing, either consumer, family member, or service provider, story practice sheet, evaluation form, pens or pencils, and scratch paper. If you are doing this training as a group, make sure you have enough copies of the materials for each person to have their own, and make sure you have copies of the constructive feedback forms. Also, be sure to reserve a room, a projector, a screen, a laptop, and work out any technical challenges before the training begins. If you have any questions, contact NAMI Wisconsin at 608-268-6000. So what is Voices in Action? Voices in Action is a workshop that provides the skills needed to help you tell your mental health story and use it as an effective advocacy tool. It was modeled after NAMI Smarts for Advocacy, a NAMI signature program. Adaptations were made to better meet the needs of Wisconsin advocates. Plus, Voices in Action was developed as an online training that can be led by local affiliate leaders rather than the state office. This train-the-trainer model creates an opportunity to reach a much wider audience. Voices in Action is a program perfect for affiliates of all sizes and in all parts of the state. Once trained, affiliate leaders can help everyone in their community use these skills to be an effective advocate both in their local communities and at the state level. So what are the goals of this training? The first is to provide a basic understanding about why advocacy for mental health is so important and how your story can influence others. Second, we will guide you through writing your own concise yet powerful story. We'll do this together using 7 simple steps. We'll also read some sample stories which are provided for you in the handouts so you can get an idea of what content an effective story might contain. Finally, we will brainstorm people and places where we can share our mental health stories in different capacities. Although many people think of advocacy as being done mostly on the state and national level, it's vital in our own communities and is often the best place to start creating change. I hope by the end of this training, we'll all have an idea of where to use this. Before we get started, let's take a look at the handouts that were included. In your packet, you should have the following handouts: 7 steps to telling your story, a constructive feedback form, a 2-page story practice sheet, 3 sample stories, 1 from a consumer perspective, 1 from a family member, and 1 from a provider or advocate. And finally, an evaluation form, which we hope you will complete so we at NAMI Wisconsin can make this training as strong and comprehensive as possible for all affiliates. Don't worry at this point about what to do with each of these. We'll go through them one at a time as needed. Right now, I just want us to take a moment and do a quick body scan and identify if there are any emotional triggers you may have before beginning the training. For some, telling your mental health story can be empowering, but for others, it may feel very emotional and overwhelming. If you find yourself feeling that way, it's okay. It's a normal part of the healing process. We just want to be aware of these things as they come up and deal with them before we begin telling our story to our audience. If at any time during this training you feel a trigger, feel free to pause the training, take time for yourself, and continue later on. That's one of the many nice things about an online training. You can go at whatever pace you choose. So with our housekeeping out of the way, let's continue with our agenda. The first thing we'll do is identify who our policymakers are. If you don't know, that's okay. It's a very quick, easy process to find out. Second, we'll do a warm-up activity. The nice thing is, if you are doing this training alone or as a group, you can choose to pause it during activity times or absorb the information for later and continue on with the slides. It's your decision. Next, we'll brainstorm the question, why is my story important? We'll walk through some tips for telling our story, listen to a sample story, and identify what made the story work. Finally, we'll write our own stories and practice telling it to others so we can give feedback to help us know what worked and what didn't. And with that, let's get started. Let's begin by identifying who these guys are. You've probably seen their faces and you may know their names. But what about these folks? Do you recognize their faces or know their names? Most people know officials such as the president or the governor, but struggle to identify those serving at the state or county level. I tried to pick 4 legislators from each corner of the state near where affiliates are located. If you don't know them, that's okay. There are 99 representatives of the Assembly and 33 state senators, which is a lot to keep track of or learn. But you can start by learning who represents you and your community specifically by visiting the website listed on this slide. You'll see a search bar on the homepage that says, Find My Legislators. Simply type in your full address and it will pull up their names, photos, and contact information. So now, let's explore what makes a story more or less effective with legislators. Note that the word legislators is used often in this training. However, feel free to picture the leaders or audience you may use these skills with. As mentioned, this could be a church leader, a mayor, a principal of a school, etc. Think of any recent story someone told you about mental illness. What made it effective? What didn't? If you'd like to pause the slides to brainstorm this idea on your own or with your team, feel free to do that now. Otherwise, you can follow along with some examples I have. People typically give similar responses for a less effective story. They don't connect the experience to a larger issue. The story has too much detail or an unclear purpose. It takes up a lot of time, or the audience is wrong. For example, the use of jargon, acronyms, or language that only a specific identified group would understand. Now, on the flip side, what makes a story more effective? Some common responses are, the story was clear, concise, and easy to follow. It was short and to the point. It resonated or touched the listener, and it inspired the listener to want to take action. This last response, inspiring the listener to take action, will be a very vital part of writing our own stories later in the training. Now that we've identified our potential audiences and brainstorm what may motivate or be most effective with them, let's look at what motivates us. Why should we tell our story? Listen to these 2 statements. Do you believe they are true? Every American who experiences mental illness deserves the opportunity for recovery. Everyone can experience recovery with the right mental health services and support. We probably wouldn't be a part of NAMI if we didn't believe these statements to be true, and as such, these points might be a great motivator for us as we tell our story. But, as we know all too well, these beliefs have their challenges. Too many Americans do not receive the treatment they need. There are many reasons for this: lack of services, accessibility, reluctance to seek out treatment, a bad experience with a care provider, stigma, finances. Can you think of other examples? There is actually, on average, a delay of 8 to 10 years from the time someone first experiences illness to the time they receive treatment. And what can happen in a decade? Oftentimes, people experience school failure, unemployment, or they become involved with the criminal justice system, creating even more hurdles. This right here is the source of advocacy. It is about connecting personal experiences with the bigger picture in order to influence change for others. As we get closer to writing our own stories, I want you to keep these 3 things in mind. Number 1, your story is always right. It's your story, therefore, you get to tell it from your perspective. Number 2, your experience has value and meaning. Keep in mind that what resonates with legislators or other leaders is emotion and empathy, mixed with facts and figures. Your story will likely to bring out some emotions in your audience. You have to think, how can I connect this to the bigger picture? Find statistics that show how many others are experiencing this struggle. Number 3, you don't have to have all the answers. If your legislator asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, you can say something like, I don't know the answer to that at this time, but I'd be happy to follow up with you. This also works to your advantage in terms of getting your foot in the door to further the conversation later. And finally, have an ask. The ask is the action piece. Telling a story is one thing, but what do you want your listener to do after you leave? Now we know all stories have value and meaning, but it's the way we tell them that makes the difference in how effective they can be to enforce change. So let's go through 4 simple tips to writing your stories. The first one is to recognize that your audience is not your therapist. This goes back to our original piece about learning our emotional triggers and doing a body scan. It's natural to feel a bit emotional while telling a difficult story. However, it can make our stories less effective when it gets filled with too many strong feelings. It may make the listener feel overwhelmed or burdened to help you in that moment. They may think you are just venting or unloading your problems onto them. And let's remember, the goal behind advocacy is to connect our story to the bigger picture and inspire actions that will benefit others. Ultimately, you are not asking them to fix your personal issue right there. You are asking them to see your issue as something bigger that impacts an entire community, state, etc. Tip number 2 is to keep it brief. This may be the hardest one for people. Sometimes folks feel that if they do not tell every detail of what happened to them, the audience will not understand what brought them to this point. Let me stress again, you do not need to tell every detail. By doing this, the listener may become confused, bored, or zone out. Also, at public hearings or other important meetings, you may only have a limited amount of time to speak. You want to make sure you get your main points and your ask across in the allotted time. With that said, know that coming up with an effective story does not happen overnight. It takes time and practice to develop. Tip number 3, emotion should move, not overwhelm. Again, do your emotional body scan. Speak to your audience in a genuine, heartfelt way. Your listener should not feel obligated to help you in that moment, but have enough of a reaction that it will trigger some action. Finally, tip number 4 is to motivate with hope and recovery. This can be tough for some people as well, especially if they are still in the moment and not yet in recovery. If you struggle with this, think about what would have helped or what could help others in your situation in the future. Overall, we are hopeful by basic human nature. We like to root for others who face adversity, so this can be an effective advocacy tool. At this point in the presentation, you may choose to pause the slides and do some discussion with your group or some self-reflection on what you've just learned. Then continue on when you're ready. If you have any further questions that can't be answered, you can email NAMI Wisconsin at namiwisconsin.org. Attention, Advocacy Coordinator. We can help you work through those so you can feel confident as you go through the rest of this training. With these tips in mind, let's get started. At this time, take out one of the 3 sample stories that are included in your handouts. You may use whichever one you feel most connected with, either consumer, family member, or service provider. Read it to yourself or to another in your group and jot down your reactions to how the story is being told and some of the key elements. Now, discuss as a group or brainstorm on your own. What moved you? What really stood out or drew you in? Was there a clear ask that inspired you to take action? Take a few minutes to really capture these pieces. Now, take out the handout entitled 7 Steps to Telling Your Story. This lists the core elements of a clear, effective story. Think back to when you were in grade school and were learning how to write. This should feel familiar to you. Using the sample story you've just read, walk through these 7 steps and jot down the answers to the questions. We'll be using the same format to write our own stories later. Alone or in your group, pause the slides and point out the exact words, sentence, or phrase that fit into each of the 7 steps. Remember that the 7th is critical. This is the difference between story time and advocacy time. Keep in mind that legislators expect you to ask something of them, so don't feel uncomfortable. Regardless of their response, thank them for their time and plan to follow up to build a relationship. You can do this by writing a letter and thanking them for meeting with you and reminding them of your ask. If you get the impression that they aren't on board with your ask, inquire if you can be available as a mental health reference for them in the future. Schedule regular meetings with them. This doesn't have to be at the Capitol. It can be in your district. You may also choose to track legislation relating to mental health and get involved with events or public hearings that relate to your goals. If you need more guidance on this, contact the Advocacy Coordinator at NAMI, Wisconsin. We'd be happy to help you. All right, you have all the tools you need to write your own story, so let's get to it. To do this, you will need the following handouts. Number 1, story practice sheet. Number 2, 7 steps checklist. And number 3, a sample story for reference. Before you begin, let's go over some common questions and reminders. Many people struggle with deciding which perspective to use because they may fall into various roles. Some individuals are living with a diagnosis, are a family member, and a service provider. I recommend you pick one perspective and stick to it so you don't confuse the audience. You may choose to use the one that you may feel the most connected to. You also may have several different stories that you tell with different audiences. But stick to one for the purposes of this training and to create the most effective story and go from there. Let's begin. At this time, pause the slides and spend about 20 minutes writing your stories. If you need more time, that's okay too. Just a reminder, we don't need or want every detail. Now that you've written your stories, discuss as a group or reflect on your own how that process felt. Was it difficult or easy? Did you have trouble deciding which details to include? Did you feel any emotions while writing? Pause the slides and discuss. Now it's time to practice sharing your story. If you are doing this alone, you may want to find someone to listen at least a few times. You are welcome to call NAMI Wisconsin and tell your story to staff. We'd be happy to listen and give you feedback. If you are doing this as a group, pair up. You will need the handout entitled Constructive Feedback Form for this activity. During this exercise, timing is very important. Remember, I mentioned earlier that with some audiences, you may have limited time to speak, so think of this as a slightly longer elevator speech. Here's how it will work. The first person will tell their story for 3 minutes. During this time, the listener will take notes on the feedback form. Listen for some of those key elements we discussed earlier. Then, the listener will spend 3 minutes giving constructive feedback. After that, switch roles and the second person will spend 3 minutes telling their story. Again, the listener will take notes and spend 3 minutes giving feedback. If it takes more than 3 minutes to tell your story, there are likely a lot of extra details or pieces added. You may want to condense. That's okay, it's our first time doing this, and this is where feedback can really be helpful. You can pause the slides at this time for this activity. Now that you have both listened and told your story, discuss how the process went. What was effective in your partner's story? What feedback was helpful? If you're doing this alone, reflect on these questions yourself. Once again, if you are doing this with a group, take time to tell your stories. Public speaking is not something many people enjoy, but practice makes perfect. If possible, allow folks from different perspectives, such as consumer, family member, or provider, to share. Also, brainstorm or discuss as a group this question. Where might you use these skills? If you are doing this alone, perhaps you can share at a future affiliate meeting or event. That concludes the training. Be sure to give yourself a pat on the back or give your group a high five. The final thing we ask of you is to fill out the evaluation form included in your handouts. This helps to make the training better for the future. You can either mail the forms to NAMI, Wisconsin, Attention Advocacy Coordinator, 4233 West Beltline Highway, Madison, Wisconsin, 53711, or you can scan and email them to nami@namiwisconsin.org, or you can fill out the SurveyMonkey version. You have lots of options, so please provide us with some feedback. Thank you for taking the time to learn Voices in Action. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us at nami@namiwisconsin.org or by calling the NAMI Wisconsin office at 608-268-6000. We are here to answer any of your questions.